That's one sound it makes. The trumpet of the Lord. Amen? Amen. It's a shofar. This is a Yemenite shofar. It's from a kudu antelope. There are different types of shofars. The ram's horns, the smaller ones, are the ones you often see. But this is one that they often blow at times of festivals, like the Feast of Trumpets, which we heard about, and other times. So it's appropriate. I've had this for about a year, and I really love it. I've been looking for a reason to use it. And today is a big day. Does anybody know what day it is? Sunday, the Lord's Day. Yeah.
The Lord's Day, yeah.
I mentioned it briefly last week, and briefly on Thursday too, when a few of us were together. Well, today is the first day of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles that we just read about. So, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. It means Sabbath peace, or have a peaceful Sabbath. And the feast or the festival of Tabernacles begins today. It is a 7 or 8 day festival, counting the final Sabbath day, beginning with a Sabbath and ending with a Sabbath. And as we read, the Feast of Tabernacles is one of the 7 annual biblical festivals, or holy days of God, that were introduced to Israel at the time of the Exodus, as we just read about in Leviticus 23. The Feast of Tabernacles was one of the annual pilgrimage festivals, when people journeyed from all over the nation of Israel to keep the feast in Jerusalem. And it was to be a joyous celebration, and one that would be celebrated throughout the generations. All of the annual holy days really are rich with meaning and symbolism. And taken together, they reveal the progressive fulfillment of God's plan for mankind. God called the children of Israel out of Egypt into the wilderness, and he gave them feasts, appointed times at which he was going to meet with them. And I've become very interested in these Hebrew holy day feasts and festivals because I've been seeing that they seem to present a framework or a model that shows the individual believer's growth and salvation. I had somebody tell me about that once and made me think, and I started looking into it, and I've just been finding it very interesting. And I've been finding that studying these God-appointed holy festivals can be both fascinating and rewarding, as they definitely foreshadow and point to Christ, especially this Feast of Tabernacles. And today I'm just going to give a quick overview of what is happening with the fall feasts and mention a couple of very interesting topics I've turned up in my recent studies of them. So just take it all in, okay, and then decide if there's something more that you might want to look into after this. So what does the Feast of Tabernacles represent? Well, at its most basic level, it's a fall festival, celebrating the abundance of God's blessings in connection with the ingathering of the fall harvest. Our Thanksgiving holiday is modeled after this festival, for example. And Sukkot means booths or tabernacles. So this week-long holiday of Sukkot is also known as the Feast of Tabernacles. It is a joyous harvest festival And it's a reminder of how God sustained the children of Israel during their wilderness wanderings. The people were to dwell in temporary booths and to rejoice over God's provision as well as His presence. And many Jewish people still build booths today in their yards, in their synagogues for this holiday, and they at least go out and take their meals in these temporary dwelling places. And it is therefore a representation of faith in God's protection and His promises. In addition, the Feast of Tabernacles looks forward to the great ingathering of believers after the return of Christ, for the time of His 1,000-year rule or millennial reign that comes here on earth. And I'm planning to talk some more about that in upcoming weeks and months. But last week, we talked about the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, which was Wednesday. And I mentioned the Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, that occurred the week before. And today begins the week-long Feast of Tabernacles, which completes these three fall festivals or holidays. And to truly understand the Feast of Tabernacles, you need to understand what just came before it. If you notice in the text, it says all three of these holidays occur in the 7th month. And much like our calendar, Israel's calendar has 12 months. But the 7th month is a very special month. 7 is a real biblical number. Of course, we first hear about the number 7 in the account of creation that we've looked at, and which we also read about here. The Lord created everything in 6 days, and on the 7th day He rested. He sanctified. He completed. And the number 7 carries with it that meaning of completeness, of sanctification, and of rest. So this feast completes these holidays that all land in the 7th month, which is a Sabbath month for Israel. And the first day of this holy month begins with a convocation, a blowing of trumpets, ram's horns, or shofars. And the ram's horn was sort of the equivalent of a siren that we would hear today, for example. It means stop what you are doing. Pay attention. So on the very first day of the 7th month, they are to stop what they are doing and pay attention. Israel, in its Sabbath month, was called to complete its understanding of God's redemption for them. They were to stop, pay attention, and prepare. Because on the 10th day comes the Day of Atonement, the day of which the holy God would meet an errant people. And as I said, we talked about that last week. My wife Lori is working on her PhD, and she plans to do her dissertation on Christ in the tabernacle, which is a really cool idea, I think. There is incredible symbolism all throughout the architecture of the tabernacle and the temple. If you remember, there is the Holy of Holies, which is a cube. And the Holy of Holies contains within it the Ark of the Covenant. Not like Steven Spielberg shows it, but it's within the Holy of Holies. And in the Ark of the Covenant is the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments. And above the Decalogue is the mercy seat. And that's a really cool idea because it shows mercy above law. Can't miss that. And then above that is the Shekinah glory, the presence of the Lord. And there's a lot more to say about that, but suffice to say that Christ was present in the tabernacle just as He tabernacles or dwells with us today in the hearts of those who believe in Him. and how he will ultimately dwell with us forever. And the Feast of Tabernacles also contains two powerful elements, water and light, that foreshadowed Messiah. Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, who gives us living water and who is the light of the world. An interest in the annual holy days with their deep meaning and rich symbolism has been enjoying something of a revival in recent years. I've been hearing about it and watching it. More church groups and individuals are rediscovering the holy days and are attempting to recognize and observe them in some fashion in order to learn and benefit from them. Because these holy days are instructional aids to help us learn the deeper truths of God and more about who He is. Many of the various Messianic and Sabbatarian churches of God have been observing these holy days for years, and they really point to the Feast of Tabernacles as one of the great ones. But I want now to go briefly into two related topics that I find very interesting about all of this. They have to do with the coming of Christ, Advent, both times. His virgin birth as a human child, which we celebrate at Christmas, and the advent of his second coming and millennial reign. First, Christmas. Well, this may sound shocking to some of you, I know, but Jesus might not have been born on December 25th. We've talked about that a little bit in the past. Nobody really knows for sure what day he was born. Some say that was just the time of a major pagan holiday that fit well with what the church wanted to accomplish at the time that they assigned that date. But we've also seen that the date of December 25th has a much older tradition, back into the early centuries with the church fathers, before those pagan holidays were considered. Some thought it was the date of his birth. Others thought it could have been the time of his conception. And the conception concept fits well with what we're learning today. Because comparing scriptures and history, it appears that Jesus, the Messiah, at his first coming, or Advent, was very possibly born during the fall holy day period, at this time of the year, during the Feast of Tabernacles, in fact. Just as the tabernacles or tents represented temporary dwelling places, the Messiah was made manifest in a temporary dwelling, his human body, as he came to tabernacle among us. You see, God has always wanted to tabernacle among us from the very beginning, as we see in these verses. Exodus chapter 25, 8 and 9. God says to Moses, "And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle." John chapter 1, 14 says, "And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us." That word dwelt is actually tabernacle. And ultimately we see it at the end of time in Revelation 21, which says, "And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them." And the purpose for this feast was for us to realize the earth, and this earthen body in particular, is not our final home. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 says, "For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." From 2 Peter chapter 1. "Knowing that shortly I must put off this my tabernacle, even as our Lord Jesus Christ hath showed me. And Hebrews chapter 11 says, For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And every year at this feast they would sing Psalm 118, which we heard from today. And look what we found there. Verses 14 and 15 say, The Lord is my strength and song, and has become my salvation. The voice of rejoicing and salvation is in the tabernacles of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord doeth valiantly. Mention salvation twice, and the Hebrew word for salvation is Yeshua, Jesus. The impeccable historian and gospel writer Luke passed along some key information in the first chapter of his gospel. It says, There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, of the course of Abijah. And it came to pass that when he executed the priest's office before God in the order of his course, according to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. Another great historian from the first century, Josephus, explained that those courses that it mentioned were like shifts for the priests. They rotated in service by the week. So Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, was a priest of the course of Abijah, the 8th course, or the 8th shift. It mentions it back in the Old Testament, 1 Chronicles 24. It's talking about this. It says the 7th to Hakkoz, the 8th to Abijah. It's talking about the courses of the priests. And since the religious year began the first day of the month of Nisan, which basically is our April, and each course served 1 week, the 8th course would be the 8th week. And that puts it into the first week of June. Here we find in Luke 1, verses 10 and 11, it says, And the whole multitude of the people were praying without at the time of incense. And there appeared unto them an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. Well, the first week of June is typically the Feast of Pentecost, which is likely why the whole multitude was there. Luke 1:23, And it came to pass that as soon as the days of his ministration were accomplished, he departed to his own house. And after those days his wife Elizabeth conceived, and hid herself 5 months. He not only served his week, but had to stay and serve another week for the Feast of Pentecost, when the multitudes were there. They all served for those festivals. And that brings us now to the end of June, which is when it says his wife conceives. Luke 1:26 and 7 says, And in the 6th month the angel Gabriel was sent from God into a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. So it seems to be saying that Mary conceives in Elizabeth's 6th month, which would be the end of December. And giving birth 9 months later would be the end of September, where we find the Feast of Tabernacles. So it sort of works out that way. It's really interesting. And if you think about it, there were probably no shepherds in the fields at night during the winter rains and the snow in the mountains. The likely reason there was no room in the inn was because there were over 2.5 million Jews there from all the nations to keep the feast as God required them. And think about it. If you were going to conduct a census or tax people, wouldn't you do it right after the final harvest, when they have the money and they're all coming to one place? Or would you rather send tax collectors and census takers out on camels in the middle of winter to roam through the mountains in the snow, hoping to find where they might have hidden their assets after they've had 3 months to hide them? This makes you think. And what better time during the biggest party of the year would there have been for God to send his Son among us, when there was great rejoicing toward God, even if they were not fully aware of the tabernacling among them? So as I said, I'm finding these interesting things, and Jesus might have been born at this time of year. Don't worry, we're still going to celebrate Christmas in December, though. And then we also see this feast at the Lord's second coming in the book of Zechariah. Zechariah 14 says, "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. And it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which come against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." So we see this feast is so important to God that he demands mankind keep it even during his 1,000-year reign. And then it goes on to say, whichever nation refuses shall be greatly punished. And the symbolism of tabernacles may ultimately be fulfilled at his second coming, when he will once again tabernacle among men, this time as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the mighty ruler, finally providing a millennial rest, a Sabbath for all mankind and for the earth, as we read about in Hebrews chapter 4. It will truly be a Shabbat Shalom at that time. And now, the blood moons. Genesis chapter 1, 14 through 16 tells us that God created two great lights, the sun and the moon, to divide the day from the night, and to be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. So the sun and the moon, along with giving light upon the earth, are used by God to give us signs and to send us signals. And we often miss such signs, I think, because we don't follow God's biblical calendar, which operates on both solar and lunar cycles. We follow the pagan Gregorian solar calendar that was originally set up by Julius Caesar as the Julian calendar, and then later adjusted by Pope Gregory XIII to accommodate leap years and to match with astronomical events like equinoxes and solstices. That's what we follow today. We don't follow the Hebrew biblical calendar that God gave. So we see that the sun and the moon are used to divide the night and the day. They are used for the days and the years of the calendars. They do mark the seasons of our years. How then does God use them for signs? Well, there are many mentions of the sun and moon in the Bible, and they are sometimes involved in special events. And one such sign is mentioned as a blood moon. The Bible includes 3 mentions of blood moons. First, from Joel chapter 2. It says, "I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." From Acts chapter 2. "The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And Revelation chapter 6. I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, and the whole moon turned blood red. Well, these verses refer to Christ's second coming, a sign before the great day of the Lord, or the day of Christ, which I think is the rapture time, after the tribulation, but before the wrath of God. And we'll talk about that in weeks to come. But the blood moon seems to be a sign. And something like it occurs in our time today too. Because astronomically speaking, a blood moon refers to a lunar eclipse, a full total lunar eclipse, which occurs when the moon passes through the Earth's shadow. And the Earth's shadow consists of two parts. There's a dark inner core called the umbra, and a lighter outer part called the penumbra. But rather than being truly dark, the inner shadow is usually tinted orange or red by light passing through the ring of atmosphere surrounding the Earth, like that. And depending on the atmospheric conditions of the Earth, the umbra may take on a range of colors from light coppery red to very dark, sometimes almost total black. But the light illuminating an eclipsed moon around the Earth is coming from and through thousands of sunsets and sunrises all around the Earth. So these lunar eclipses are very often reddish in color, and hence the common term blood moon. Now, lunar eclipses occurred on Passover and Sukkot in 2014. And they are occurring on Passover and Sukkot this year of 2015. 2 times each year, which is very rare in itself, especially 2 years together, and both on high Hebrew holy days. And this pattern is made more significant by the occurrence of solar eclipses between them. Most recently, we had a partial solar eclipse 2 weeks ago on Rosh Hashanah. Very interesting. In Judaism, a solar eclipse was seen as a negative sign for the nations of the world. And a lunar eclipse is generally a negative sign for Israel. And in this series of events that's happening now, we see both. This same very rare astronomical pattern has occurred other times. Most recently, it occurred in 1967. It happened in 1948. And one of the other times we notice was 1492. And these times are all confirmed by NASA as full lunar eclipses. Historically, those 3 years may be the most significant years for the people of Israel since the time of Jesus. Does anybody know what happened in 1492? Columbus. I'm not really talking about him, although he is involved here. In April of 1492 was the Edict of Expulsion from Spain for the Jewish people by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And that Edict of Expulsion demanded that all Jews who would not convert to Roman Catholicism must leave the country. This was a time of the Spanish Inquisition, when all Jewish property was seized by the Catholic Church, and they had 14 days to get out of Spain or they would be tortured and killed. And this was not Christianity, by the way. It was simple religious tyranny of the time. Christians get a bad rap for stuff like this. But here's the 1492 that most of us know about. It was a time when those Jews gathered their maps and their money, and they gave them to an Italian Jew by the name of Christopher Columbus and said, "Go and find us a place to live." That was what was behind that. And he, of course, came to America and found a place that eventually became a home and sanctuary for the Jews, as well as all other people since who have needed a place to escape religious tyranny and oppression. And in 1492, or the biblical years surrounding that year, God lit up the heavens with this same pattern of events. 4 blood moons on the first day of the same Jewish holy feasts. Interesting. Another time we notice this pattern is 1948. 1948 was a year in which Israel was reborn. God gathered together the Jewish people who had been scattered and abused around the globe and brought them home to the place he had prepared and promised for them, just as the prophets predicted that he would. And that year, God lit up the heavens with 4 blood moons. God seemed to send us a signal. And this also happened in 1967, when Jerusalem was reunited with Israel for the first time in 2,000 years. And Jerusalem is the city of God, where he has placed his name, and where Jesus Christ was crucified to fulfill the sacrifice of atonement for sin, for any and all people who call on his name. Jerusalem is where he rose from the dead, and where he will return to establish his kingdom here on earth. So this was an enormous event in the history of Israel and the world, and that year we saw 4 full blood moons. Well, it's happening again today. Today is the final of the 4 blood moons that are happening in this sequence of events. In fact, this one's really interesting. We were mentioning it just before. It is a full moon, a harvest moon, a supermoon, and a blood moon total lunar eclipse. It's going to be really cool. But it's happening on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. The last one was the first day of Passover. One before that was Feast of Tabernacles. One before that, Passover, with solar eclipses in between. Very interesting. I'm not going to make any predictions, no prophecies. I just figure you've been hearing about it. It's happening now, and there were some very interesting things in the past that happened during these events. So, you might want to look into it. What should we take away from all of this? Well, God works in his own time, not in our understanding of it. He is coming again. We know that. We can take that away from this. He's calling us home. He wants to tabernacle with us again and always. We can take that. It may be very soon. So let's watch for the signs that he has described in his word. Until then, we can carry on with peace and joy. Shabbat Shalom. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Until then, we've got that song to sing now. calling us home. And I think he's showing us some signs. So again, we're going to look into some of that in upcoming weeks and months. And I hope we find something great. We'll finish with shalom to you. Shabbat shalom.